Picked Rebbe Lezer about the Sor Lazozel. I mean, there's no such thing as a korban which is brought outside the Mishkan, outside the Beis Hamikdash. So what is this concept that through the lottery system we choose one goat? They're both consecrated, and the Kohen Gadol, he confesses the sins of the Jewish people on that goat, and it's sent out into the desert. So here he had said that normally the prosecutor of the Jewish people is Samach Mem, is Satan, is Satan. And by giving him shochad, the goat which is sent out into the desert is bribery, which we'll discuss more specifically. And because you give him this bribery, Satan says to Hashem, you have a very unique people, very special. They're literally like angels. And he mentions many things to equate us and Yom Kippur to angels. We stand, we don't eat, we don't drink, we don't cohabit, and so on and so forth. And just as angels are free of sin, the Jewish people are free of sin. Just as angels, there's no strife among them. There's no strife on Yom Kippur among the Jewish people. The little angels. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu shomei edusin shel Yisrael ben hakateger shelhem. And Hashem listens to the testimony from the arch prosecutor against the Jewish people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu shomei u'mechaper al HaMizbeach v'al HaMikdosh v'al HaKohanim. And as Zolte brings atonement for the Mizbeach, for the Migdosh, for the Kohanim, and for the entire Jewish people. That's the Midrash. That's the picture of Rebbe Lezer. So I had mentioned yesterday, says Soto Inyan, he says, what's the secret? Which the Ramban says, I will reveal the secret. This is like Kabbalistic. Ye'ovdim le'elohim acherim. Those who worship these alien gods. Who are these alien gods that the world worships? Hima malochim. They worship the angels. Osim lem korbanos, and they bring sacrifices to the angels. Ve'im lem l'reich nichoach hin shenemar. And it gives pleasure to the angels. It does their will, so to say. He says, V'nei Torah osur l'gamri kabolos elohusam. The Torah prohibits with absoluteness serving any type of deity, any angel, or any type of service. But nevertheless, on Yom Kippur, Hashem commanded us, Shenishloach sor b'midbar. We should send this goat out into the desert. This is the important point. L'sar ha'moshel b'mkom ha'churban. The archangel that oversees all the locations of desolation and destruction. V'aroi lo, and it's appropriate for him. Why? B'mneishu bailov u'matzilus kocho yovo achorev u'shmomo. Because he's worthy of this, because due to his dominance over this area, all levels of destruction and desolation, because he's the cause of all in the zodiac that brings death and wars and quarrels and wounds and disruption. He is the archangel who oversees this whole area of existence, which allows this to come about, who causes it to come about. V'haklal nefesh l'galgel madim. And we spoke about the red star. The red star is the Gemara says in Shabbos that if a person is born under the red star, he has a tendency for blood, and it has to be expressed. So either the person should be a murderer, or the person should be a moel or a shochet. That's the Gemara at the end of Shabbos. Because since the person is born under the red star, he has a tendency to be associated with blood. So he should be, again, a shochet, a moel, or a bloodletter. People would let blood, because otherwise it will express itself in actually murder. V'chelko min umos hu Esav. And the main proprietor over this area, listen to this, is Esav. Shu'ama yorish cherev. Esav is the nation which inherited the sword. V'amalchamos. Edom is the nation which inherited the sword and actually are the war wagers. Umin abehemus asirim izim. Okay? So he says, Chelko min umos. And his portion among the nations is Esav, that he inherited the sword and wars. Right? This is Haydaim de Esav. This is the bracha which Yitzchak had given to Esav. I mean, he designated him, that's his classification. Yaakov is Hakol Kol Yaakov, and Esav is Yudaim de Esav. Al-Char B'chot Tichya. He lives by a sword. That's what the Pirkei Rebbe, that's the Ramban is explaining in the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer. So if you remember, I asked the question, we find that Bilam was commissioned to curse the Jews. Why was he commissioned to curse the Jews? Because Balak, the king of Moab at the time, did his research and found out that the leader of the Jewish people, his power lies in his mouth, Moshe. So he commissioned a person who also his power is in his mouth, because Bilam had the ability to curse. Therefore, he was going to curse us and destroy us. Ultimately, Bilam was killed by the sword, and the Torah makes it a point. Bilam nerag b'chorev. Bilam was killed by the sword. And Rashi cites Chazal, the Midrash. Why does the Torah make it an issue? It's important for us to know that he was killed by the sword. Because what is the profile of the Jew? Kol, the voice, which is Torah and Tefillah. The profile of the non-Jew is Al-Char B'chot Tichya. So he took our profile, which is the power of the mouth. So therefore we took his profile, which is the sword, and we used his vocation to eliminate him. Therefore, the Torah is making a point that he was killed by the sword. So I asked the question, Achar b'chot tichya, this is the profile of Esav. It's not the profile of other nations. Bilam was not an Edomite. And yet Rashi says, does the Torah make it a point he was killed by the sword? Because his so-called persona is Achar b'chot tichya. Therefore, he was killed by the sword. But that's Esav. So what I explained then was that Esav misunderstood what his father told him. When Esav was told, Achar b'chot tichya, it wasn't a blessing. But rather what it was a designation. Esav believed that he was the heir apparent of his father to inherit whatever his father represented. And Yaakov was not, because he was the firstborn. Yitzchak says to Esav, Achar b'chot tichya, that your classification is no different than any other Gentile. You're no different than the nations of the world. Achar b'chot tichya. He took it as a blessing, but rather it was a classification. Therefore, he was telling Esav, no ifs or buts. You have no relevance to spirituality. Your persona, your essence, is the physicality. It's to what? It's all, as he said, it's to bring destruction and wage wars. That's what it is, like the rest of them. Esav thought, he says, we have a blessing for our forefather, Achar b'chot tichya. Therefore, they rejected the Torah when Hashem offered them the Torah. Because he said to Hashem, the Edomites, we have a blessing from our forefather, Achar b'chot tichya, and it says in Ten Commandments, Lo tirtzach, thou shalt not commit murder, therefore we can't accept it. From this, the way the Ramban is explaining the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer over here, he says that the Edom, that his chelik among the nations is to bring about cherev, milchamos, and all kinds of destruction on the world. That is the profile of Edom. That's the koch of Madim. That is his thing. When we find the Yaakov had wrestled with the angel until morning. That angel, if you look in the Ramban over there, was Samach Mem. The angel, archangel of Edom, represents the ultimate prosecutor of Jewish people. And as a result of that, he tried to eliminate Yaakov, and Yaakov was victorious over him. He was wounded, he was injured by him, but he wasn't able to kill him. But that was the struggle. That's the good struggle between good and evil. That's Samach Mem. And he says Samach Mem is the archangel that oversees desolation, destruction, and wars, and all levels of suffering in the world. Okay, that is Samach Mem. And he says, and his area of domain is the location of desolation, which is the desert. No life exists in the desert. It's total desolation. So the Ramban had said, Hamoshe was person prepares a banquet for his master. Take one of the portions that you're preparing for me and give it to my slave, who's so and so. So why is the person who's hosting the banquet giving this portion to that slave? It's because that's the dictate of the master. And he's not doing it for his own honor, he's doing it for the honor of the master. He's giving it to the master, and the master is sending the gift to his slave. The Shomer mitzvoso v'osel chvod kol shetzivo, and the host, who's the subject of the king, of his master, is following the order of the master. Now this is very interesting. And the master, because he has compassion and pity for the host, Rashiu kol avodov nenin mimenu, siyisapid b'shroch v'loganuso. Hear this. And the reason why the master wants the slave to receive the portion from the banquet, because he wants the slave to speak praiseworthily about the host. So the master is taking a portion from the banquet, giving it to the slave, so the gift is coming from the master. But since the slave ultimately is benefiting from the subject, he will speak praiseworthily about the subject of the master. He says, Zet Tama Gorolos. That's the Samach Mem. This, as he said, this is the Shochad. This is the bribery which we're giving to Samach Mem. And he cited the Midrash that he equates the Jewish people on Yom Kippur to what? To angels. Ki'ilu haya kohen magdish osa b'peh l'Hashem l'Azazel. We find the L'Azazel was not designated by the Kohen Gadol to be l'Hashem u'L'Azazel. For God and Azazel, if that would be the case, if he be dead, that means that has to do with, that's a deity. You're worshiping an angel. You're giving both goats to Hashem as a gift. Now God, through the lottery system, chose to give one of those goats which are given to him, to give it to the slave. Who hibul gorel v'yoduch chelak lehem, cholak lehem. Kin yishenemar. V'gam achrei hagorol ha'mamido lifnei Hashem lomar shushalo v'nanachnu mechavnin b'shilucho elu rotzon Hashem. And when we send this person into the desert, whose agent is he? He's the agent of God. Therefore, we find this animal, the goat is not slaughtered. Now he says, it says eschukosai. What's a statute? A statute is not just something we don't understand. A statute which, with the Satan and the nations look at us in a very critical way, saying it doesn't make sense. Dvorim sheitzora b'kachik b'hem v'umas olam mishivin aleim levisha shatnus. They say the Jews, their behavior is actually contradictory. It's totally nonsensical. Wearing shatnez, Jews not permitted. Por aduma, sarmish taleach. So they find some kind of fault, because we say all that's contradictory. Why is it contradictory? If shatnez is not permitted yet, if the garment is made of linen and you want to put wool tzitzis on those corners, you permit it. Paraduma, here it purifies the contaminated, but it contaminates the pure. As they say, it doesn't make sense. But regarding the sarmesh taleach, that's not a claim against us. Lo motzu korbanos tshuva l'musa olam olenu kehem alishi Hashem avo sarmesh taleach yeshivu aleinu. Seemingly they should come and have a claim against us. The korbanos make sense to them because we bring korbanos to Hashem, sacrifices. But what about the Sol HaZozel? Seeming we're behaving like them. Why don't they come with a claim against us that we're doing idolatry? Yashu shanu osim k'masem chein paraduma. Hear this? Neshu nazis chutz lemachne. He says the paraduma is done outside the machne. It's slaughtered on Har HaZeisim. The paraduma is slaughtered on Har HaZeisim. In Yom Domel, in Yud Sar Mishtaleach, Laveruach Hatuma. It's also, what does it take away? Paraduma takes away the contamination. Kin Shnema Bo'osid Es Leviv Es Ruach Hatuma Avi Bin Oretz was a Tovin Tam Kibus Bigdei HaMishalech Es HaSoyer Lazozel. He says for that reason, that's the reason why the person who takes the goat out into the desert, he's contaminated to the point that even his clothing got contaminated. Vasorif is Aporo. The one who burns the Porah, over here, this parsha, there's a Orach Chaim HaKodesh, and we learned this in the Ramak. He said something interesting. If a person was liable for the death penalty, the sword, and let's say he had to die by the sword, after he would be killed with the sword, they bury the sword. You weren't permitted to benefit from the sword. Skila, the stone that they put on him, after he was toppled from this elevated location, and he breaks his neck, and they put a stone on him, that stone had to be buried. He explains why, but I want to first tell you what the Orach Chaim HaKodesh says. He explains, we find that if you won't find a korban chatos, a sin offering, if a person transgresses deliberately. It's only inadvertent. Only inadvertent. Why? So he says he had studied, it's known from the Arizal that, and it's based on the Zohar, when a person sins, what do you create? You create an impure energy. It's referred to as Ruach Misavo, a spirit which is contaminated. You create a contaminated spirit. That contaminated spirit goes on the person. That's what happens. Now, what is the intensity of that contaminated spirit? It's not the ultimate level of intensity. Why? Because it was done inadvertently. The transgression, the sin was inadvertent. When the person brings a chatos, one of the components of the ritual is he has to lean on the animal. He takes both of his hands by the head and he leans on the animal. What is the concept of leaning on the animal? He says when you lean on the animal and you do tshuva, the impurity that's on the person's body due to the chet that was done inadvertent, that tumah transfers onto the animal. You listening? So the animal that you makriv, that you sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, has a degree of impurity on it, and when you sacrifice that animal, that impurity is vaporized, and therefore, as a result of that, the person has full atonement. This is he's saying the name of the Arizal. However, if a person would sin deliberately, where the impurity is much more intense and overwhelming, if the person would bring a korban, what would happen to that korban? The impurity would be so intense, the animal would be putrefied, And Hashem says, because the animal is putrefied with impurity, I don't want that kind of animal to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash or in the Mishkan. Therefore, only a sin which is transgressed inadvertently do you bring a chatos, but not a sin which is transgressed deliberately. Because otherwise you putrefy the korban, and Hashem says, that korban to me is an abomination, I will not allow it to be brought on the Mizbeach. That's the idea. As he says, the Sor Lazozel, this goat that was thrown down the mountainside, it carried all the sins of the Jewish people. Could you imagine? Whether it was deliberate, inadvertent, whatever the severity of that sin was, the Kohen Gadol, being the representative of the Jewish people, the Shliach, he transfers all the impurity of the whole Jewish people onto that animal. You got it? You could imagine the level of impurities on that animal. It has such overwhelming level of impurity, the person who takes it out into the desert becomes contaminated because he is directly connected with that level of contamination. The Kohen Gadol, it was passed through him, it goes on the animal. But now this person is carrying the animal, taking the animal which has this overwhelming level of impurity. And where do you bring it? What is the source of all that impurity? Who caused that impurity? It was Samach Mem. It was the Satan. He's the ultimate seducer of the Jewish people. Therefore, you take it to the desert, which is his location, as the Ramban is explaining, that's the Shochad. God says, take that and give it to the Tzamach Mem. And as a result of that, that will appease him. And as a result of that, he will not prosecute the Jewish people, but rather speak about them in the most praiseworthy context. That's the Orach Chaim in name of the Arizal.